French President Emmanuel Macron will face votes of no confidence today. This after his decision to force through the unpopular pension reforms, which aims to increase the retirement age from 62 to 64. Now, these pension reforms have sparked demonstrations across the country, with the bigger question being if Emmanuel Macron will be able to survive a no-confidence motion. To talk more on this, we are now being joined by Jonathan Liz from London, who is a journalist and also the director of the think tank British Influence. Thank you so much for joining us, Jonathan.
Hello.
Right, so I want to first seek your analysis as to, do you think that the French president will be able to survive the confidence motion today, and what kind of political crisis will it trigger for Macron?
Well, I think we have to be clear that the president's role is distinct from the parliament in France. So whatever happens, Macron himself will be safe because he has a personal mandate from the French people. But many people in France are speculating that his prime minister, who is responsible for the French government, will not survive the coming weeks and months. She'll in effect be the fall guy for this crisis over the pensions.
Right, and how do you assess the latest pension reform bill? Do you think it was required or essential for France?
That's very hard to say, because it really depends on your philosophical, political outlook. France has a much lower pension age than most of its neighbours. In Britain, it's 62, right, which is going to become 68 in the coming years. In Italy and Germany, I think it's 67, whereas France is 62, moving to 64. But you could argue that the French have it right and that people shouldn't be working longer while others are having tax cuts and the rich are getting richer and so on. And so the French have a tradition of staging mass public protests and strikes when workers' rights are hit. And that could be an example to other countries as well. In Britain, these reforms tend to be accepted without too much indignation and resistance from the public.
Right, I was just coming to that. Like you mentioned, that the current retirement age in France is 62, which is well below the EU average. Then why is there so much, why are people not accepting the pension reform bill in the country?
Well, people aren't accepting it because, in fact, many people want to go back to the age of 60, which it was before 2010. I suppose the other point to make in all this is that when pensions were first introduced over 100 years ago, in Britain, for example, life expectancy was much lower than now. So there is, an argument to be made that people, should be working for longer, I suppose, and that people were never expected to live very long after they stopped working. But on the other hand, in France, more than in other countries, there is an idea that there is more to life than work, and that you work to live, rather than, for example, in America and perhaps in Britain, where the philosophy is more that you live to work. And so there is huge indignation about this. They're going to force through the reform, as I say, which is going to be very difficult for Macron and his sort of public support going forward. It remains to be seen what happens to the outcome, whether this law actually does take effect, if it's reversed in the end by the next Prime Minister. But I think there is an argument and debate to be had across Europe about what kind of life we should be having with regards to work, how important work should be, and what kind of pensions people should be expecting in their retirement.
But absolutely, Jonathan, I was just coming to that. That is the pension reform indispensable or unbearable for the French public?
I think it's going to be very unpopular. I think 70% of the French public are opposed. But using this constitutional mechanism, 49.3, the government will force it through. So it looks as though it will become law whether or not the French Parliament actually wants it to become law. That's the problem. So you have this sort of mechanism where the Parliament can sort of, the government can force through a law without the explicit consent of Parliament. there may be a no confidence motion afterwards. In fact, there will be a no confidence motion afterwards, but the government will probably survive that. So it looks as though this will become law, but that doesn't bode well for sort of France's morale going forward. And it's possible that it could be reversed in the future by a future government.
Despite scores of demonstrations in France and the growing opposition against the French pension reform bill, the French government has clearly said that the pension changes are needed to avoid crippling deficits in the decades which are linked to France's aging population. How do you assess that?
Well, obviously, other governments are making similar points that as we have an aging population, more people will have to work. The UK government is trying to get more people over the age of 50 back into the workforce. And obviously, there are problems down the line about how to cater for an aging population, particularly with the cost of living crisis and sort of economic pressures across the board, sort of stemming from sort of COVID, the invasion of Ukraine, etc. So there are sort of short-term and long-term problems. Again, this requires a conversation to be had about the level of taxation in the economy, about how countries can support themselves. But fundamentally, there has to be a level of fairness and there has to be public consent. If the public is not consenting to this change, which in France they're not, and Parliament's not consenting to it either, that is going to create a democratic deficit, let alone a financial one.
Absolutely. Experts also say that whether the government stands or falls, Macron will soon name a new prime minister in a bid to try and reset his image. What are your viewpoints on this?
That seems likely. As I said earlier, the prime minister will probably be the sacrificial lamb or the fall guy for this. Because it's her name that's associated with this unpopular reform. The president has his own mandate, and so he will survive regardless. But
Right.
France is going through political turmoil, undoubtedly.
And how do you see these demonstrations playing out in the next couple of days with the union workers clearly saying that they will continue to demonstrate even if the bill gets passed?
Well, France, as I said, has a long tradition of public resistance, of strikes and protests when rights are eroded or being seen to be eroded. So I imagine that these strikes will go on for several weeks to come. And as in the past, there'll be a sort of a gradual acceptance that the reforms are here, but there'll be a sort of very low morale and high public discontent for months and years to come.
Right, Jonathan. My last question to you before I let you go. Talk to us about how the pension reform bill will affect the women in France.
I don't really know how it will affect women more than men, for example. I think that it depends on sort of the contributions that you've made over your lifetime. Perhaps some women will have made fewer contributions if they've taken time out of their careers for motherhood, for example. But this is a big issue that we have in Britain as well, with women who have been sort of campaigning about to receive their pensions that they feel they've lost out over many years, the WASPy women, so-called. But that also feeds into a broader conversation about women in the workforce, about how to increase productivity in the economy. In Britain, we're having a big conversation right now about childcare, which will allow women to go back into the workforce because, as in many countries in Europe, a lot of women can't afford to work because childcare is so expensive. So these issues are all linked between sort of how women are able to work during their sort of working age life and what kind of pensions they can expect when they retire.
Right, absolutely. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us in WION and sharing your insights with us. Thanks very much.
Thanks.